Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Asia Institute for a seminar today on journalism in Korea. I want to take a moment to introduce some of our upcoming events. My name is Emmanuel Pastreich, the director of the Asia Institute. And I'll just tell you, on October 26th, we'll have a seminar here on North Korea and the future of Northeast Asia. Then on October 15th, before that, with the Korea Federation of Environmental Movements, we'll have a seminar on nuclear power in Korea and in East Asia. November 19th, we have a seminar on deserts and the desertification and its impact in the region, also with the Korean Federation of Environmental Movements. And then December 17th will be about recycling in Asia as part of our ongoing program on the environment. I also want to announce that we have the Asia Institute Stop Climate Change pin, a little bit smaller than I thought, but very attractive for 2001. I have purchased a whole bunch of them, and I hope everyone will buy one today. Also encourage everybody to become a member if you're not already. And I would like to introduce our speakers today. So we have an extremely distinguished group of international reporters located here in Seoul. First, Don Kirk, who is the I don't want to say the Don, the Don of reporters, and has maybe you've written for
a number of people.
Many newspapers and journals, and it's Forbes, you know?
Forbes Asia. Yeah.
Forbes Asia, right. And then we have Stephen Borowiec here from the Los Angeles Times, and Wang Son-Taek from YTN, who was just stationed in Washington, D.C. for the last 3 years. So all three have experience both with journalism in Korea and in overseas in the United States. So this is, I'll just make a few opening remarks and then it'll be open. I'll just start from Don and go around, and anyone can say anything they want as long as there are no fist fights or violence. I think, and we welcome, of course, questions from the audience as well. So maybe I'll ask Don to get the ball rolling.
So, well, having arrived last, it's appropriate. I guess I should speak first.
Makes sense.
The last shall be first, or something like that. Anyway, I'm glad to see all of you here, and I hope since this, rather small group, make this a conversation rather than, any kind of presentation. Chance has you have your gizmo ready to, you got it, you're getting us all down, right?
It's the fifth column.
Terrific. So I think we're supposed to be talking about, being a foreign correspondent. Covering Korea is frustrating because so much of the story is in North Korea, and we can't go there under usual circumstances. So we do go there under highly artificial circumstances, guided tours and so forth, but we don't actually witness the launch of a missile. We don't see the what's going on in the prison system there. We write about all this from here, which is frustrating. In the South, we do have a whole lot of contacts. Over the years, we've been writing about dissidents and economic issues and political issues and so forth, writing almost a distraction about these problems. There are quite a lot of people in the South who will talk. There's also impediments to getting the news. There are barriers, but I wouldn't say that the barriers here are really worse than those that you would encounter in many other countries. Every country has its own special customs and habits and hang-ups and so forth. In a sense, here in South Korea, you have quite unusual access that you might not have in a lot of other places. And that's not to say you have unbridled freedom, but you do have access. One source that we all have are people in think tanks and universities who comment quite often. We also get invitations in one sort or another to many sort of events, press conferences, speeches, and all those other sort of public relations propaganda events that some of us like to go to. We're often given quite a nice lunch or dinner when we do go. You might take a jaundiced view toward that kind of coverage. On the other hand, you do pick up insights into economic issues and military issues, diplomatic issues, and so forth. And you really don't want to just sort of make a habit of ignoring all of them. So I think that over the years, I've covered a wide range of stories here in South Korea. During demonstrations, mass demonstrations after the two schoolgirls were run down by a 48-ton American armored vehicle in 2002. They were out on the street here, right near us, every night for literally months. And the demonstrations even reached a high point after the two Americans who were in the vehicle had been acquitted by a military court, which ruled that they couldn't have seen the girls. The girls were walking with their backs to the vehicle on a narrow road, listening to music and so on. And they acquitted these two soldiers, and those led to even more difficult demonstrations, much more huge mass demonstrations. Also covered the beef demonstrations. I don't know if you really remember that. They're almost forgotten now. And I'm not really forgotten, but I think we've sort of moved on past the era when everybody suspected that American beef might create mad cow disease. But for months out here again on this same street, same wide avenue, Sejong-no, there were terrific demonstrations going on, approaching violence. There were confrontations, a lot of water cannon that were fired. There were barriers erected by police buses, so it was quite dramatic. But, so you do have this contrast between covering North Korea and South Korea, and then you have periods when not a lot is going on and you feel rather bored, and then suddenly, out of the blue, something happens, whether it's North Korea exploding another nuclear device or some event here that is totally unexpected. Much of the news here on the Korean Peninsula is unexpected. Whether it was the outbreak of the Korean War, which hadn't been expected, I can assure you from everything I've read. By the way, if I may say how that story was, who first revealed that story? It was the United Press. That was the days before United Press merged with INS, International News Service, and became UPI. A United Press correspondent walked into the American embassy to get a coat that he left behind at a reception the day before, and he asked the Marine Corps, what's going on? Anything happening? He said, yeah, the North Koreans just invaded South Korea. And he had the exclusive. He beat the Associated Press. This journalist became quite well known just for that reason. Unfortunately from my point of view, he spent most of his career working for the Asia Foundation in San Francisco. But nonetheless, that's how he got that story. Oh, we could go on and on with stories like this. I may have spoken long enough. I could probably speak for another half hour. But I just leave you with that story of that surprise and the fact that many of the stories that are the biggest and best here are really not expected and can be quite fascinating at moments when you're trying to getting bored with nothing going on. Well, on that note, I think we'll turn it over to Mr. Borowiec.
Thanks, Don. Thank you, and thank you for that very frank and comprehensive breakdown of just what it is hacks like you and I do here. Emmanuel asked me if I would perhaps talk a little bit about the differences between how journalism functions in the US and perhaps in Western countries generally and in Korea, and I guess you can draw some generalizations as to how things work here as also in China and Japan. There's some similarities. So in telling that story, I think the central character of that story is the Gwanggaeja. Does anyone know what a Gwanggaeja is? Okay. The truth of the matter is that nobody really knows what a Gwanggaeja is. For those of you who aren't familiar with this term, Gwanggaeja is a term that's used in China, Korea, and Japan. It has Chinese origins from the Chinese characters for guanxi, which means relation, and jia means person. And if you open a Korean newspaper, you will see this word everywhere. In particular, you will see information being attributed to this mythical character, the Gwanggaeja. And if you are a critical reader of the news, as I hope you all are, as I think we should all be, you inevitably end up reading newspaper reports and being kind of unsure as to where this information is really coming from. And sometimes in the Korean media, they use this term to refer to someone who might be expressing their opinion, or someone who might be leaking confidential information. And it's not the only kind of unnamed source. In the Korean media, you will see all kinds of titles that are used to refer to people, that might be people in government or in business or independent analysts. And many, many of them are just referred to by these titles that don't allow the readers to know who they actually are. And so this is something that, to me, my Korean is not great, but my Korean is at a level now where I can read the news. And one of the sharpest arrows in my pocket as a foreign correspondent is that, unlike a lot of my colleagues, like some of my colleagues who may be sitting here, I can read the news and I can find stuff that maybe hasn't made it into the media in English yet. And if there are any aspiring foreign correspondents in the audience, I strongly recommend that you learn the language of whatever country you want to be working in, so that you can find these nuggets that haven't been reported yet by the Associated Press or Reuters or whoever. And so the reason I'm rambling on about our friend the Gwanggaeja is I think the reliance on unnamed sources is probably the biggest difference between the Western media and the Korean media. And the relevance for me of this practice is that it's often kind of difficult for people to get people to tell me their names. Because I write for a major American newspaper, and like all major American newspapers, they have a very high opinion of themselves and of the journalistic standards that they adhere to. So it's very hard for me to get unnamed sources past my editors. They usually don't let me do that. And if they do let me do it, there's got to be a really good reason why. And the typical Korean explanations for why someone doesn't want to give their name is almost always the same thing. It's almost always because this is a sensitive issue. And I've told Korean people that if, as a reporter, I limit myself to only things that are not sensitive, I will be left writing about hanbok and kimchi and Anguk, and that will be about it. Because everything here is sensitive to somebody. And it seems like everybody here, or on every issue here, there's somebody who wants to keep something off the record. And so I've been, over the past couple of years, I've had a lot of conversations on this topic with a lot of people. I think in general, the journalistic discussion over unnamed sources is quite interesting because there are cases where it is, in everyone's best interest, it is almost necessary to protect the identity of the source. Because they might be releasing information that, if their identity became known, they would, they could be harmed in some way, or they want to protect their family, etc. But in a lot of cases, I think, in the Korean media, the circumstances really do warrant allowing readers to know who these people are and why they are releasing this information. In some cases, you even have journalistic articles where a spokesperson for the government is explaining how taxpayer money is being spent, and they're doing that on condition of anonymity. Now, for the public spirit purpose of journalism, I think readers should know who these people are, and they should know where this information is coming from. Also, you have cases where analysts are providing their opinion to reporters, and they're saying whether something is good or bad, and they're doing that on condition of anonymity. I don't see why they have to be anonymous. And the most common defense for this practice is that what the common practice of using unnamed sources does is it allows people who are not authorized to speak to the media to participate in the public discussion. And it actually enriches the public discussion. We can discuss that argument, and I'd love to hear the opinions of everyone here, but I hope that moving ahead, Korea will have some people, like, for example, this might be too grand of an example because this is a big case, but somebody like Edward Snowden, who was willing to, at great personal risk, leak very valuable, very public service, valuable information, and he did it on the record. He did it showing his name and his face. And the consequences for him personally will be severe, but what he has done, he's done a very good thing in terms of pushing the public conversation forward. And a lot of people know a lot more things because of what he did. And they also have a greater ability to trust in the value of that information because the person who released it was willing to put their name to it. So that's probably, there's a lot there, but I look forward to hearing what everybody else thinks about all that.
Excellent. So maybe I'll just say a few words as well on this question about Korea, media in Korea. I think the environment is, of course, I haven't been here. I've been here only 9 years, so I don't have enough historical perspective like Don, who's the I don't think eminent degrees of journalism here. I'm not a journalist, although I write a lot for newspapers. I'm not sure why. Oh no, I was complimenting you on your.
No, I was thinking about, what I said to Steve was the gentleman from YTN.
Oh, well, we were going to go.
Yeah.
I know I'm not really a journalist, but I hope you'll let me.
No,
say a few words.
Absolutely.
I wanted to be a journalist, but.
No, you have terrific perspective.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm a crypto journalist. So in Korea, increasingly journalism is a complicated art. Events like ours, this is a perfect example, very relevant. If they don't have the proper relationship with the media, they don't exist, right? And increasingly, this has become a major issue. That journalism is not merely about telling people facts, which they subscribe for, but it actually defines whether institutions, organizations, schools, etc., exist. And so journalism has become, I think, very powerful in many respects in Korean society as a result. It's also complicated. In some respects, Korean journalism, I think the level, one problem you have sometimes you read like the mainstream newspapers, often the main articles are quite similar. It's hard for me to see much difference in terms of the content of them in the original. And the big fights tend to be in the opinion page, editorials. And in the case of Chunang-ilbo, I write for Chunang-ilbo, but the big war at Chunang-ilbo is on the committee for the opinion page. And the editorials include considerable amount of variety, but it's really limited to that part of the newspaper. But I found in general that the reporting has become more homogeneous over the last 3 or 4 years. Also, alternative media, I think that the main alternative newspapers like Hangul-dae and Gyeongyang have become much more formalized. They have big publicity wings that look for opportunities to make money through publicity, and so they're much more cautious in their reporting as opposed to what they were like, say, 15 or 20 years ago. And then there's a lot of stuff out there you're not really sure where it comes from that people post, and sometimes extremely interesting, but it's less reliable in terms of its content, and you get the sort of fads. So Don mentioned the issue of Mad Cow. I remember fondly the Mad Cow times myself, and I was really amazed because it became just everyone was talking about Mad Cow. It was like every other reporting was pushed out. I was have been very interested in environmental policy in Korea, and I discovered that all the environmental organizations themselves were just talking about Mad Cow, which I guess is vaguely environmental, but didn't really seem that way to me. So Korea does have a tendency to go through these waves when everybody's reporting on exactly the same thing at the same time, and that's somewhat unfortunate. On the positive side, there is a very highly educated population in Korea, and there is good journalism out there. It takes a lot of work to find it sometimes. The editorial pages tend to be more important, in my opinion, in terms of reading. The front pages tend to be rather similar. I have really enjoyed. I mean, for me, it's been very good. I had a chance to write, for a lot of different newspapers here, and had a very good experience. But I'll go to someone who actually knows both sides. Wang Son-Taek, please.
It's nice to see you, everybody. I am feeling something very sense of pressure by your comment about 관계자. So maybe I have to explain or give some idea of what is going on about behind the word 관계자. We Korean news guys use the word 관계자 and 당국자. We distinguish two words. And then sometimes we use 고위 관계자 and 관계자, and 고위 당국자 or 당국자. These are four categories we have. 당국자 or 고위 당국자 means directly involved people, the official. So when we are dealing with North Korean nuclear issue, it is all about office of peace negotiation in Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So somebody who works in that office, it is called 당국자, we say that. And when we say 당국자, and it might imply he or she is director level. When we say 고위 당국자, it is about assistant minister. Sometimes director general, but director general is also category of director. I mean 당국자. And what about 관계자? It is about different offices, but somebody involved in that issue, and who knows it? Maybe who knows something, little bit about that something. So this guy is happened to meet some reporter and talk about that little tip of the thing, and this reporter can imagine what's the whole picture. Because he or she got this small tip of the whole story. Not he or she got one puzzle of the 100 puzzle picture, and then this reporter is trying to make 100 puzzle picture for the reader. And this situation, this reporter usually use the word 관계자. So it is all about trust in this society. We actually value or we actually evaluate a peer's story. So when from our point, when I say I reporters in the reporters room, when we say some story using 관계자 or 고위 관계자, we imagine who he is, we imagine who she is. So we can distinguish this is true, this is false. I remember you can trust. You see that some article using 관계자, it is as fact. So it is a little bit difficult to you, but from our practice, our kind of games of rules of the game, we usually do. So maybe we better develop this kind of very ambiguous style of gathering, collecting stories. But you know what? Somebody who is involved in an important issue, and then he just casually say something, and reporter heard about it, and this reporter got some idea that, oh yeah, this is the one decisive puzzle that I looked for, and then this reporter is trying to draw his own picture, and then he or she use 관계자. So this is the context of the 관계자.
Ask you a little bit about say, American or international journalism and Korean journalism. What are some of the differences that you've seen in your experience?
Yeah, I was in Washington D.C. for 3 years, but what I can say is I can understand what you are talking about, how difficult it is being a correspondent in a foreign country. I am a foreign correspondent member in Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Korea, I have my own space in the building. I have my own contact a lot. So if I want to really want, I can access to the minister that day. I can access vice minister that day. Yeah, that is very convenient. But when I was in DC, it is totally difficult for me to access to get just Korea desk. In 6 months, just one time or just one time in 1 year, it is totally messy.
I worked on the Korea desk years ago. We never met with the press.
Yeah, you're right. So
Never, never.
Sung Kim, he's a special representative for the Korean affairs. So he generously got some special meeting for reporters.
Yeah.
This in 6 months period or 1 year period, and then Daniel Russell have got some 1 year small reception event. So that's all. And then so all I can say is that yeah, I can understand you're saying. It's very difficult being foreign correspondent in foreign country. Yeah.
May I make a comment? Actually, both of you made very interesting remarks. But when I call the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here, if I try hard enough, I can usually get somebody.
Right.
Whether maybe only public affairs spokesman, usually I can get somebody on a relevant desk. And I'm not going to quote them by name, that is. But I can get them. So it's interesting that it's easier here to do that than it is in the U.S. And what you said is very interesting, the lack of access. Did you not have access to somebody in the East Asia Division in Public Affairs who would help you?
There's a public affairs designated officer who got a call, who got an email, and then I have to wait 1 day or 2 days, and then I got a small message that we don't have anything to tell you at the moment. Please wait one more time.
I wonder.
Like
Sorry, I'm sorry to continue this dialogue.
Adam Skatina, she replied directly something. So yeah.
No, I wonder why. If I really want to get somebody in the foreign ministry, I can insist. I gotta speak to them. I gotta speak, and usually I can get somebody. I hear that is. So why is it that it's people say that Korea in many ways is a closed society, very difficult to penetrate barriers. Why is it that simpler for the foreign journalists?
When I was in Washington D.C., you reminded me that I did not try that much. Anyway, yes, in this country, I personally, there is some gap of status of the country. The United States is the superpower country in the world, and in Washington D.C., a lot of foreign correspondents. Probably scores of countries sent their correspondents. In this city, Seoul, we are kind of middle-sized country, and the United States is quite a huge country, only one blood alliance of my country. So for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they have special designated spokesperson for foreign correspondent. Usually they work for U.S. correspondents. So yeah, that's a little bit different situation for foreign correspondents, even though we have a little bit of letter changes.
For sure.
Okay, well, just to clarify a little bit what I was talking about earlier, I'm really, as you can see by the way that I've dressed, I'm the only panelist wearing blue jeans. I'm not really the type of reporter who's reporting to the ministry every day and calling up people who wear suits because I'm just not interested in that kind of journalism. It's boring to me. I like journalism where that involves actually leaving home and going out to a neighborhood on the other side of town and meeting the people there and seeing how they live. And I think that's, to me, that's just a more exciting way of working. For me, when I read the newspaper in the morning, the stories that catch my attention are generally not a senior ranking official said something on condition of anonymity. I'm much more interested in a dispatch from a really interesting part of the world, some reporter who has gone very deep into the human dimension of the story and has come back with, a compelling story. So when I was talking about getting people to speak on the record, I was talking more about just people that you meet in more informal settings, not necessarily just in government. And I'm not sure. Does anyone have a question?
Talk about your experience in,
We
you
have
did a story from Daehan No the other day where there was a big demonstration and so forth. Let's talk about that.
Okay, well, on Sunday, I heard that, is everyone familiar with the story of Baek Nam-gi, the farmer who passed away this week? Okay, well, for anyone who's not familiar with his story, he was participating in an anti-government rally in November of last year, and he was knocked over by a police water cannon. He fell back, he hit his head, he lost consciousness, and he had been in a coma for the last 10 months, and he passed away on Sunday. And when I heard of this news, I was looking things up on social media, and I saw that there were a large number of riot police at the hospital where he was, and there were these suspicions that the police were going to seize his body, perform an autopsy on the body, and then claim that he had some kind of underlying health condition, and that was the reason that he died. And the reason of his death actually was not related to him getting knocked over by this water cannon. And in doing this, the police were going to absolve themselves of responsibility. And so I had the advantage of living very close to this hospital, so I left my house on foot and I went there. And this is the type of reporting that I really like to do. I really like to be in person, and I like to take down as many of the visual and sensual details as I can. What the place looks like, what the place smells like. Try to capture a bit of the atmosphere. Try to really, I think, the goal of descriptive writing is to capture a sense of transportation, of making the reader feel as if they are in this place, of making the nikim, I guess you would say in Korean, or the bunigi, making this very real and very palpable to the reader. And so I wrote a dispatch. I talked to a bunch of people there. I managed to meet a couple of activists who had known Beck since the late 1980s. And I wrote a piece describing what things were like there, and fortunately it did pretty well. My editors were pretty happy with it because it sparked a pretty big discussion on social media, mostly favorable, not entirely. Whenever I write anything like that, I get certain South Korean conservatives telling me that I don't understand that these are pro-North Korea and they're trying to sort of overthrow the country, and I just don't understand because I'm not Korean and they're all Malgamies and you've just been brainwashed by them. But so that was a good example of the type of journalism that I like to do. And fortunately, while I was there, everyone that I talked to was happy to tell me their name and their age and their occupation. So very thankful to them.
I have a question about journalism. Something as a reader, I find a lot of times in American journalism, say New York Times particularly, there's been a trend towards what I would tend to think of sort of like hard-boiled novelistic sort of rhetorical approach, where it opens up something like he was unshaven and was waking up from a hangover. He drank some water and it was good. It starts in the middle of a scene and gives sort of like paints a picture and sort of like grabs your attention. But I took a journalism class in high school back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, and that was forbidden, right? I mean, you're supposed to say when, what, where, right? So I have a sort of a queasy feeling about that issue of journalism. I mean, I know things keep changing. What is your feeling about this?
Well, you must be much more comfortable reading the Korean press then. Because you'll open a Korean article and it will say, in this dong, in this gu, in this city, at this time, in this building, on this floor, at this time, this person was talking.
Right.
But there is, over the past 20, 30 years, there's been a lot of the techniques of literature have bled into journalism, and journalists have, I mean, let's be honest, almost all journalists like me are failed novelists. Anybody who's writing for a living really wants to be a novelist. But
I feel your pain.
if you're like me and you're not talented enough, you end up writing for newspapers. And so at every
Or teaching.
so at every opportunity, I think people are trying. I say the challenge of a lot of journalism, especially of being a foreign correspondent. There's a really big difference between being a foreign correspondent and being a journalist for the domestic press. And that big difference is you cannot assume that your audience has any interest in what you're talking about. If you're a Korean journalist and you're writing for the Korean public, you can assume that these people are interested because this is their society and this is directly relevant to their life.
Right.
But for me, writing about Korea for an American audience, I have to assume, one, this might be the only thing about Korea that these people read in 6 months or in a year. And I have to assume that they have no reason to be interested in this. I have to find a way, and I like this challenge. I have to find a way to connect with them on a human level, on an emotional level, on whatever it happens to be, but I have to tell them why this matters, and I have to tell them why they should care about this. And I find that the most effective way to do this is to appeal to their humanity and tell what is an essentially human story, not an essentially Korean story. So just to address your question a little more directly, using those sorts of literary techniques is a way of accomplishing that. It's a way of
Right.
it's a way of bringing your story across with more power than just the information you give it.
Can I add? Please.
Actually, I envy you while you're talking because when I was in DC, I just searched some kind of story which is directly interconnected to Korean matters. That's what Washington Korean Washington correspondents do there. So local things actually at there is quite. I was interested in a lot of things happening there, but usually most of them do not related with Korean audience. So I have no choice but to just focus on something which is related with Korea. So this is something very frustrating. I am in Washington DC. That's wonderful city, wonderful place to see, to feel, but it is almost forbidden. So I envy you.
Would your editors have accepted a different story if you tried to make it more interesting, like even
Of
though
course,
it's unfamiliar?
Of course, if I can make a very, very interesting story interesting enough to impress my boss in Seoul, I can make it. But it's not easy to make stories just several hours and without any preparation, just a couple of hours to make a 2-minute report package, impress your boss. No way. You need 3 days, 4 days. The gatherings and the interview schedules and then shooting schedules, and so that's kind of minimum cost of time. But we got just 1 day, one shoot. So we have, and there are a lot of stories related to Korea. So this is something frustrating.
If I may say, there's another dimension to reporting from here. Is this thing on?
Yes.
Yeah. There's another dimension to reporting from here, and that is reporting on big business. For years, well, for a lot of time here, in the early times when I used to come and go, I always used to cover these stories like, I interviewed Kim Dae-jung a number of times and wrote about dissidents and human rights in South Korea. But then I had to write a book about the Hyundai Empire. And I started getting into that, and it got extremely complicated, extremely difficult, and all kinds of barriers, and also all kinds of interesting revelations. So once you get into the business story, which is another type of story, you'll find a lot going on that has a whole lot to do with the rise of Korea as a super capitalist and by global standards, despite problems, a highly successful economy. We know that Korea has problems, but relatively speaking, this is one of the world's more, if not one of the world's more successful economies. Lately, I keep on running into these chaebol stories because I do write, I don't write all the time, but I write enough for Forbes Asia. I did a story about the latte group, was the last story I did. And that was really a hard story to do because I couldn't get any high-level interviews. All I got were public relations people. They just wouldn't give me any interviews on a higher level. I did not meet Shin Dong-bin or his slightly older brother Shin Dong-ju. I did get a ride up that huge tower, that enormous tower that we all see out there. I got a ride up to the top and looked around from there, which gave some colorful material. It was good. I finally got a story out of this, but it was very frustrating because nobody wanted to talk to me. This can be, there are other sides to this. A year before, I interviewed the youngest of the Hanjin Cho brothers, who has his own little empire called, not so little, by the way, I don't want to say, it's not little. He has his own establishment called Meritz, M-E-R-I-T-Z. And he's the youngest of these four brothers. The oldest one, of course, is in charge of Korean Air. The Hanjin group, one of them died. The Hanjin group has had terrific problems, which we've been reading about in the paper. But, you don't expect people to talk very frankly. But this guy did give me an interview. And I asked him what he thought of his older brother, the one who was in charge of Korean Air. What do you think of him? And I cannot believe this quote. It's one of the most bizarre quotes I've ever heard. His quote, and I took notes and it was on the record, he said, quote, "I hate him," unquote. You just don't see these people talking like this. But every now and then, something comes out unexpectedly, and you really get stuff that you really get interesting stuff. So he talked to me. Whereas in contrast, when I was trying to do the Lotte story, nobody had real responsibility to talk to me. Public relations people were quite pleasant and nice and charming in the case of these young women in charge of public relations. We had coffee in the lobby of the Lotte Hotel. They paid for 1 cup one day, and I paid for 1 cup the other day. 15,000 won a cup there, incidentally. Seriously. They do give refills. They give refills. But anyway, I finally got it. I did get a story, but I couldn't believe how close this organization was. If I may take this one step further, because Steve knows about this. Shin Dong-bin is chairman of the Korea branch of a prestigious organization known as the Asia Society, which is an international organization. He made a speech at their annual dinner. And I asked the person who represents Asia Society here, well, could I have a copy of the speech, since I wasn't invited to the dinner? No, it was off the record. What? Just to pull out a few polite remarks, it was off the record. She wouldn't give it to me. And I said, well, can I just have an interview with him? Can you get me an interview? I'll just ask him about Asia Society. She said she'd try, but then she came back, no, can't have that interview. And this guy is parading around running or honorary chairman, in fact, of an international group called the Asia Society, and he won't show his face on the record in front of anybody, and he won't talk on the record and won't say a word. Anyway, I've probably spoken enough about that. But in many contrasts, the book that I did about the Hyundai Empire years ago, I did meet Chung Ju-young a couple of times, and Chung Se-young, younger brother. And Chung Mong-jun, one of the sons who was educated, got a doctorate in the U.S., helped me quite a lot in the end. But again, many frustrations. I think I probably set it up. It can be fascinating going into the chaebol here. Another dimension of reporting, which a whole other eye-opening dimension of reporting, not to be overlooked, because why is Korea a powerful, large economy? Well, it has a lot to do with these groups. And if you're going to really understand modern Korea, you should get into try to get into what's going on in that aspect of Korean life.
Any questions?
Since it just sort of came up in joke form, I would love to have the four of you talk about the new law. I think, was it today or yesterday it just became?
Yesterday.
Yeah, so.
The corruption law?
What about that?
Yeah, my understanding is it's anti-corruption law, not corruption law.
But I mean, it's needed because corruption is so prevalent here. I mean, let's not beat around the bush. I mean, it's here for a reason. Whether or not it'll be effective.
Right.
Yeah, you have the right to think like that way, but my understanding is Korean society, the level of corruption is relatively good, I believe. But there is some sense of struggle or tension between elite people and some politicians, journalists, and some group of professors. And this particular law focus on journalists and professors in private school. These two groups are the real target of this. So I say relatively Korean society corruption level is relatively nice, but these two groups, some group of people think journalists and professors in private school a little bit behind the kind of desirable line. So they introduced this law, and now it's the time you are the last voice to follow some level of clean guideline. So that is my understanding. So that anti-corruption law, you can think Korea is still currently, in terms of corruption, we are still behind, but it is just part of the whole society. Whole bunch of picture, I think we are a little bit higher than the kind of regular basis, a little bit higher.
Well, I would say, I would say two things. First of all, I've lived here for more than 7 years, and nobody's ever asked me for a bribe. So I don't think Korean society is that corrupt. I think generally it's a law-abiding, and it's a pretty clean place. But I would say if the government does want to increase the level of transparency in the society, journalists and university professors or private school instructors are not the people that I would go after. I would be looking much more closely at our friends that Don was talking about, people in the really big businesses, where one of the tenets of the Kim Jong-un law is that journalists and government officials cannot accept a meal bought for them that's more than 30,000 won. I mean, if you're talking about like society-wide levels of financial malfeasance, like these are minuscule amounts of money. Like, you're not really going to affect the level of corruption by going after transactions of that size. So while I think the law has a good purpose, if I were president of this country, which for many reasons I will never be,
Unlikely, but
Don't rule it out.
I'm going to rule it out now. I'm ruling it out on the record with my identifying details.
Yeah.
But I would say that the real what corruption does exist in society, in this society, I think takes place in a much higher level format, and it involves much bigger sums of money than what somebody's having for lunch.
I just have a couple things to add to that. One is that we don't know what the heck's going on among these family members. They're mysterious people. You can't just call them up or drop by their house or expect to get any information. For the most part, you really don't know about the interplay between grandfathers and fathers and grandsons and uncles and nieces and nephews. There's a whole family drama that's going on among this whole network of families that control big business here and medium business in general. And it's all hidden from us, no matter how deeply we think we go into this society. That's one remark. Okay, I'm not going to elaborate on that, but you get the idea. The second remark is I've often gone to the Philippines and written about stuff there. Well, the difference between here and the Philippines is here they keep on arresting these people. They give them pardons sometimes, quite often in fact, but they do put them in jail for a while. I believe the older sister in the Latte group is still in jail. And I think they arrested somebody the other day too, another one. And they tried to almost arrested Shin Dong-min, but they said for some reason the judge wouldn't agree to the prosecutor's request to put him in jail. But Lee Kun-hee was in jail for quite a while. I don't know what their cells are like. They may have jail suites for all I know. But
you don't want to be there, I think.
Sometimes the conditions are not that pleasant. After the economic crisis, there was a finance minister who was in jail for a time, and I interviewed him in Kwachun, where he was being held. And I got a 15-minute interview. He's surrounded by guards and things, and he just had one cell, and and he was not living under pleasant circumstances. They let him off finally, but I don't think he enjoyed his 6 months awaiting trial before he was finally let off. Okay, but here they do put people in jail. In the Philippines, the corruption is just absolutely wild and rampant. And although you do have highly publicized cases, former President Arroyo was in a hospital. I think she had a hospital suite or something or other before she finally got off. You have these wild cases. Estrada, I think, was under some form of house arrest. There's a guy who, in the south, a leader of a province, a Muslim province, responsible for the deaths of more than 50 people, he and his sons and henchmen and so forth. And they haven't got him yet. I guess they may have.
Well, they have a new policy in the Philippines these days.
Yeah, I know. So, in other words, the difference between here is they arrest these people and they question them, and there's great trials that go on.
Right.
More often than not, nothing happens. So the middle level people, people who aren't terribly influential, sufficiently influential, wind up going into prison for 2 or 3 years. You know, just surprising. The Seoul Foreign Correspondents Club some years ago, I used to have some position where I would introduce speakers. And I know that 2 of my speakers wound up in prison. You know,
Not because it's speaking for you, though.
right. So, but in the Philippines, this doesn't happen. They corrupt. You know, they don't nail them on all kinds of charges, which they could. So, relatively speaking, Korea is law abiding.
So I actually.
Speaking too much.
No, it was I was served with an email from my department today with all the specifications in Korean and English for the Kim Jong-nam law, anti-corruption law. And it was quite elaborate. I don't know if I can remember it all, but and rather intrusive, I thought, because it had, assuming that you had to report to your university about everything you do, which is bureaucratic. You know, it's already hard enough to prepare talks, but to fill out forms and it increases the workload. But I think the first thing that came to my mind was that if you serve as a politician or in a political party or as a minister of a ministry, you can retire and be a consultant and make a very large amount of money. There doesn't seem to be any problem with that, right? Maybe, I mean, in Korea, yeah, in Korea. I mean, well, tell me, it doesn't. I mean, for example, if I'm a minister in a ministry in the Korean government, central government, and I retire, does Kim Jong-nam mean that I can't be hired by the company who I oversaw or whose contracts I decided?
I don't know much about that part. My understanding is that kind of part is already addressed by other law.
By other law.
Yeah, we have a lot of anti-corruption laws, a series of corruption laws, last 10 years or 20 years. So this is one of the last comprehensive, like networking, whole bunch of networking, comprehensive law. So for that part, my understanding is that somebody who did the job of minister or vice minister, deputy minister, they can get a high level job in any good company, good institutions for 3 years or 4 years, but that is not all the cases.
Right.
That's a little bit of problem. So in some sense, that kind of case is actually recommended or encouraged by the society, because those people have a lot of experiences and wisdoms and a good quality of understanding working floor. So a lot of high-level officers retired and get a good job, but that is usually 3 years, and then that is not all the cases for high-level officers retired. So maybe 1/3 or more than half could not get those good jobs. They just retired and get back to the house.
Right.
Other Mr. Haller, you had some perspective from the State Department.
Yeah, I can give you. I'll give you a couple of comments. First of all, regarding your question, getting access to people in the State Department.
Okay.
When I was on the Korea desk, one of my jobs for 2 years was writing the daily press guidance. Now, the daily press guidance drives the work of the department, and it does, I think, for every government agency in DC. every morning around 10 o'clock, some guy in another office gave us the question. And we had to research the question, and we had to write an answer. That the guidance of the answer was, we have to make sure that the Secretary of State looks good, the President looks good, and that we know what we're doing, number one. Number two, we can't contradict ourselves. And number three, we have to avoid certain key words. So for example, one day I made a mistake of using the word linkage. It was forbidden for us to ever acknowledge what everybody in Washington knew, that we were paying North Korea money to attend talks. We gave them aid to attend talks. They would show up for the talks. We give them aid. That was known as linkage. But that was absolutely forbidden to ever use that word in the Department of State. And I got chewed up roundly one day when I forgot that, when I didn't realize that was a key word we could never, ever, 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 ever use. So that was one thing I wanted to say. On the question about the ethics law, at first glance, the ethic rules under the new law here in Korea don't seem that draconian. I mean, from my point of view, when I worked in the federal government, yeah, I couldn't take dinner or lunch from anybody for $50. Somebody treated me out to dinner, couldn't do that. I had to report gifts that anybody gave me. There were exceptions that were made. For example, if an old friend showed up in town and took you out to dinner, that was okay, provided you can show that the reason he's taking you out to dinner is because of a pre-existing relationship dating back before you worked in this particular job. When you are retiring from the government, there are all sorts of ethics rules. For example, you cannot interview anybody that had anything to do with a job that you were working on while you were still in the government. And then for 1 year after you're out of the government, you can't lobby your fellow employees back in the government. You can work on issues, but you just cannot go to a meeting, for example. If I went back to, say, a meeting where somebody was there from the Korea desk, I could not go to that meeting if I worked as a contractor, for example. So, but I thought that the level of in the law was pretty, not very draconian. The strangest thing was extending it to journalists and private school teachers. That's not covered under the U.S. laws. The U.S. laws only cover federal employees and contractors. It doesn't cover anybody other than those two sets. So I think the Korean law extends the anti-corruption standards a little more than it is in the U.S., but I didn't think it was that draconian a law.
Did you run into journalists?
Yes, occasionally. And I had to report the next day that I met the journalist.
When I was a professor at the University of Illinois, I had no problem talking to people at Korea desk.
Right.
So as a professor, it seemed to be no issue at all.
Yeah, professors we would talk to. Journalists, we would always, we were kind of professionally paranoid about talking to
That
journalists.
linkage comment was
That's
very
how we
interesting.
Yeah.
Who chewed you out?
Dave Straub.
Oh, well, he's a nice guy.
He's a nice guy. He had to chew me out.
He actually chewed you out?
Yeah, yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Because he's one of the guys he's one of the nicer guys I run into.
Yeah, yeah. But he had to chew me out about on the fact of I didn't quite understand the nuance
I'm
of the
sure
word.
he was very polite about it.
Yeah, just say, you can't use that word, ever.
Ever.
Yeah.
So my question is a different topic, the one we were talking about earlier about anonymity. And for me, the anonymous reporting is less about like the culture that in Korea, but more about like credibility in the story. So like if you don't name a source, you can't hold the person accountable for whatever she or he is saying. And so your story loses power. And like you shouldn't, as a journalist, you shouldn't leave it up to the reader to imagine whether whatever you're saying is true or false. So I'm just wondering if you agree with that, whether there's a credibility issue in Korea's anonymous reporting, and whether there's any sort of discussion among Korean journalists about this. Like if in the newsroom, if you get any sort of guidance about avoiding anonymous reporting that is problematic or whatever.
As I told you, when Korean reporters use anonymous people, that's extra job, not regular job. So when we use 당국자 or 고위 당국자, is directly it is countable. I mean, it gets countability. So it is clear who he is, who she is. So 관계자 is a little bit of a problem. That is the real case about anonymity. But this is extra job for reporters. Get some little more further story. So it's usually sometimes have some kind of some borderline between credibility or not credibility, but it is usually give society news story.
But
So
people
that is
don't
good.
want to be accountable for that. Like if I go to the defense ministry or the foreign ministry and say, there's a Yonhap report citing an anonymous official, can you verify this? They don't confirm it. They say we don't know where this is coming from.
This is if you don't use that anonymity, that story never comes out. So you have to calculate. So this is one scenario. You cannot write about this thing at all, but you write this story with little bit of uncredibility, little low credibility. Which side is good for the society? So if you want to really stick to the credibility, transparency, you might need another 1 week to find the name. You coming out the name. But if you kind of compromise get the story with 관계자 level, and then people know it, and then there is some discussion or debate about credibility, and then a couple of days, this parts of the world, they must be come out talking under the real name. So this is what stories are going to in this country. So first phase, it is very important to get the story coming out anyway, even though it is on the shadow.
If I may make one comment about from a foreign perspective. Of course, the Yonhap that we see is the English language Yonhap, and they do quote sources like sources in the defense ministry, sources or sources elsewhere. Because Yonhap is regarded as Korea's only news agency, and it's partly government owned, and we think, although you may not agree with me, we journalists think is heavily government influenced.
Right.
When they quote sources, we kind of think that those sources are real government sources and that they're not just talking. Like if the defense ministry sources say that North Korea fired a missile, we're pretty sure that it's pretty official, coming from Yonhap.
Right.
So I do radio reports, and I can quote Yonhap in a radio report. It's not the kind of reporting that Steve might do, but that's my view of Yonhap. Because what we see is, frankly, what foreign journalists see is the English language Yonhap, and we don't really make gradations between who's a director level or a mid-level or vice minister level or clerical level.
I would just add two things, and I would say that if as journalists, a government official gives us some bit of information and says, here you can report this, but you cannot tell them that I gave this to you, and this becomes a routine, we risk our profession becoming a vehicle for the government to uncritically communicate with the public. And that's not what it's supposed to be. So at least me, like my own ethics that I use in my job, I think I would decline to report a lot of what appears in the Korean media. That's just me. And the other thing I would mention is, if you look at public opinion poll data in Korea, they regularly show that media organizations are some of the least trusted organizations in society. They regularly rank below government, below all kinds of other organizations. So maybe we can conclude on the note that I hope in the coming years my colleagues in the media will take steps to be more transparent and to earn the trust of the people they are meant to be serving.
I have one quick comment. And this one needs a comment from you. There's a sense that there is a widespread sense that the Korean media is quite conservative and reflects a government view. Steve I think spends time in Honduras, which is may reflect a critical view, but there's a sense that we have the big three newspapers and so forth, and the sense is they're all conservative and all saying the same thing. Now that's obviously a bit of an exaggeration, but there is that sense, and that is a problem and an issue, even though they do have quite interesting commentary, as Dr. Foster has pointed out. I'd be interested in your comments, sir, about that.
So for time reasons, I'm forced to end the
Hey, we
formal
need his
part.
comment.
Oh, well, okay.
Yeah.
Then we'll have to run
Sorry.
over.
So,
Go ahead.
this is actually big stories. So, which one do you want?
You can address it.
This is actually a big topic.
The question about the government, about the big three media and the government agencies, government having pervasive influence over the Korean media.
Half true, half false, I believe.
Okay.
We have a very big three conservative media, Joseon, Donghwa, Jungang, that is true. And we have a very influential two progressive side newspaper, that is Gyeongyang and Hangyeore. And Gyeongyang Hangyeore is anti-conservative, so there's no reason for them to fixed by the government, conservative government power. So these three groups of news companies, my understanding is that their interest point is a little bit different from conservative political faction. So Joseon-ilbo, my understanding is they are trying to be part of the political power. That is my understanding. So directly or indirectly, this is my personal opinion. I cannot be responsible for this. This is my opinion, the feeling. So Joseon-ilbo is trying to get into the politics. And then Jungang-ilbo is a little bit different from that perspective. It is more like business, pro-business approach. Donghwa-ilbo is another kind of conservative side, but a little bit tension relationship with Joseon-ilbo and the Jungang-ilbo, even Park Geun-hye party. And so these groups are categorically categorized as conservative groups, but inside that group there are a lot of tensions. It is difficult for us to see them 100% collaboration. There are more fighting each other.
So I'd like to thank everybody for coming for today's seminar. We'll continue the informal part of the discussion. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you at the next seminar. Thank you. Okay.